Thank you and welcome everyone to St. Catherine University. I'm Elaine James, Assistant Professor of Theology here at St. Kate's. On behalf of myself, of all my colleagues in the Theology Department, and on behalf of St. Catherine University, it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. This is the 37th Annual Goodman Lecture. The lecture is supported by the Arthur and Constance Goodman Religious Studies Fund, which was established in 1979 by the generosity of Arthur and Constance Goodman. This fund has allowed the St. Catherine Theology Department to sponsor sponsor a lecture for over 3 decades now, focusing on interfaith dialogue between Jews and Christians. Arthur and Constance Goodman, who established the series, were themselves an interfaith couple. Arthur was Jewish and Constance was Catholic, and they experienced prejudice as an interfaith couple. These experiences were a strong motivation in their desire to promote dialogue that might lead us from hostility and discrimination to greater understanding and acceptance. Their extraordinary generosity to St. Catherine University has strengthened our theology program, as well as the university's commitment to Catholic social teaching and interfaith dialogue. We're extremely grateful for the Goodmans' generosity, and we're grateful for the ongoing support of their daughters, Mary Ann Goodman Riley and Stephanie Goodman. Mary Ann is present here this evening with family and friends. Please join me in showing thanks to Mary Ann Riley and to the Goodman family. It's my honor now to introduce our speaker, the 37th Annual Goodman Lecturer, Hanne Loeland Levinson, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Classical and Near Eastern Studies and faculty member of the Center for Jewish Studies, Religious Studies, and the Department for Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Minnesota. Prior to her appointment at Minnesota, she was Associate Professor of Old Testament Studies at the MF Norwegian School of Theology in Oslo. Before coming to the United States, Professor Levinson trained as a Lutheran pastor and theologian in Norway. She holds a doctorate of theology from Norwegian School of Theology, and she's now a member of Beth Jacob Synagogue in Mendota Heights. Professor Levinson's research centers around the academic study of the Hebrew Bible, especially gender studies, metaphor theory, prophetic literature, and biblical narratives concerning death and death wishes. Her first book, Silent or Salient Gender, The Interpretation of Gendered God Language in the Hebrew Bible, exemplified in Isaiah 42, 46, and 49, received the prestigious John Templeton Award for Theological Promise in 2008. It's an illuminating study of how gender operates in the language for God in the Hebrew Bible. She draws out the significance of texts such as this one from Isaiah. I can't resist just reading this for you. Can a woman forget her nursing child or show no compassion for the child of her womb? Even these may forget you, yet I, God, will not forget you. Professor Levinson is currently working on a book manuscript with the title Wishing for Death or Fighting for Life, Death Wishes in Hebrew Bible Narratives. And I add that many here in the Twin Cities also know Hanne as a generous colleague and as a very dear friend. Her talk tonight is entitled The Uncensored Voice, Suffering, Protest, and Lament in the Hebrew Bible. Please join me in welcoming Professor Hanne Loeland Levinson.
Thank you, Elaine, for those kind words of introduction. I also want to say thank you to the University of St. Catherine for inviting me to give the Goodman Lecture this year. I was really honored to be asked, and I'm really happy to be here. I also want to thank the Goodman family again for making this lecture series possible. It is a great honor for me to be here, and this lecture has given me the opportunity to again focus on one of the areas in my research that I really care very strongly about. It also gave me the opportunity to focus on theology in a way that I can't usually do in the regular classes that I teach at the U of M. And when I was visiting Professor James' class this morning, and we were co-teaching, I realized how much I miss talking about theology and thinking about theology. So it actually was a great gift for me to be able to be there this morning and to give this lecture. The title of my lecture tonight is, as you all know by now, The Uncensored Voice, Suffering, Protest, and Lament in the Hebrew Bible. While contemporary voices often urges us to suffer in silence or take everything as it comes from God, I find in the Hebrew Bible a very different voice. Why is my pain unceasing, my wound incurable? The prophet Jeremiah asks God. Give me children or I shall die, Rachel demands of her husband Jacob. And Elijah, pushed to his limit, addresses God saying, it is enough now, take away my life. These voices are maybe not the voices that are most familiar to us from the Bible, but they are there and not just on the margins. These voices have a significant place in the Hebrew Bible, and they give words to pain, they protest suffering, and they lament losses. The virtue in the Hebrew Bible is not to suffer in silence when life hurts. In tonight's lectures, I want to explore with you some of these voices of suffering, protest, and lament. I want to do this not just because this is interesting and fascinating literature, which I truly think it is, but also because I believe that these texts and the theology that they represent can serve as a resource source also for us in our own coping with tragedies and suffering. I want to start, though, by telling a little bit about my own journey with the topic of this lecture. I grew up in Norway, on the south coast, in a traditional Lutheran and also rather pietistic context. You might know, due to all the Norwegians in Minnesota, how many here has Norwegian heritage? Okay, well, almost 1/3. If you add the Swedish, there's a lot of us. Okay, so a lot of you are Norwegians or have a Norwegian heritage, and then you would know that Norway is predominantly Lutheran. About 85% of the Norwegian population are members of the Church of Norway still today. To give you a sense of the demographics in Norway, otherwise, Catholics, 2% of the population. Muslims are the largest non-Christian religion in Norway, but still among just 3%. The official numbers of members in the 2 Jewish congregations in Norway, there are only 2 official shuls in Norway, was 747 people in 2015. One estimates that there are about 2,000 Jewish people in Norway. When I converted, we were like 2001. But still, the numbers are very different from what you see here in the United States and also in Minnesota. Anyways, growing up in this context in Norway, I learned 2 children's songs that I keep returning to. I return to them not because they gave me valuable wisdom for life, but because I found it so disturbing that these were the messages that were presented to us as children. They fit in the suffer in silence or take everything as it comes from God theology. The first song is I'll Be a Sunbeam, or also called Jesus Wants Me for a Sunbeam. I actually didn't know that this was a song written in the United States. I grew up in Norway in the 1970s, and I knew this song as Gud vil jeg skal være et solskinnsbarn, which means basically God wants me to be a child of the sun and shine for him every day. I have included the lyrics here, the first stanza and the refrain, and the lyrics were written by Nellie Talbot and published for the first time in a hymnal already in 1905. Jesus wants me for a sunbeam to shine for him each day, in every way to try to please him, at home, at school, at play. A sunbeam, Jesus wants me for a sunbeam, a sunbeam, a sunbeam, I'll be a sunbeam for him. I have 3 sisters. And when my younger sister really wanted to bug the next younger sisters when she was in a bad mood, she would run after her and sing, a sunbeam, Jesus wants me for a sunbeam. To say it simply, it did not improve her mood at all. They are good friends today, though, so somehow she recovered. The other song was composed by a Norwegian teacher, children's writer, and song and playwright named Margrethe Munthe, and she also lived from around 1800s, beginning of 1900s. I haven't found an English version of this song, which means it's probably never made it over here. But I have given you a tentative translation. I say tentative because it is not prepared for singing. I just want to give you a sense of the content. It's called Kjære Gud, jeg har det godt, and this is a very typical poster that people would make and put on their walls on this song. And the English version would be, Dear God, I am well. Thank you for everything that I have received. You are good, you care for me. Dear God, never go away from me. Watch over everyone, small and big. God, keep watch over father and mother and all children on earth. Why do I find these songs so troubling? Are they not sweet, innocent children's songs that encourage children to behave well, be happy, and be grateful? My basic problem with these songs and the theology that they represent is that they are not honest. They do not tell the truth, or at least not the whole truth. I mostly had a good childhood, that's not the problem. The problem is that so many do not. There are so many children who are not doing well. They do not have what they need, neither physical nor emotionally. Children live in fear, in want. They are bullied and they are abused. They are ill and they are dying. They do not experience that they are watched over by God or even by their parents. As adults, many of us have experienced to get life-threatening illnesses. We experience losses, challenges too heavy to bear, and families breaking up. Many of us live with anxiety and depressions. It is not honest then to tell how well we are all doing, and it also degrades our experiences. These songs does also not tell the truth about God. I truly believe that God does not want children, or adults for that matter, to be sunbeams. God wants people to be honest, to live honest lives, and not to shine and be happy when they're not. God does not play the Pollyanna game. God does not ask us to try to find something to be happy about in every situation. Even if one does not believe in God, the God of one's imagination should at least be a God that validates our experiences and wants us to be honest with ourselves, if that makes sense. This honest voice, the voice that describes life as it is, protests suffering and laments loss, I found in the Hebrew Bible stories of suffering and in the lament texts. I first encountered these texts in my academic studies of the Bible, when I studied theology in Oslo, and I was totally captivated. It was so different from my own religious background. In the Hebrew Bible, I found words that mirrored life's darkest moments and voices that encouraged protest and lament, voices that even yelled at God. Later, when I started teaching myself, I introduced some of these texts into the classroom. I also worked with one of the chaplains on my former school in Oslo, and we introduced these voices in the liturgical life in the chapel. And I will return to some of the responses that we received to this in the end of this lecture. Lament and even death wish became topics in my research. In 2007 and 2008, I did a study of the presence, or maybe I should say the non-presence or the lack of lament in the Christian church in Norway. My research showed that of the 233 texts from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament that could be read in the Church of Norway over a term of 3 years, only 2 of them were lament texts. And if you looked at the liturgy for the regular Sunday service, there were no space for the voice of suffering or protest. The only lament included was the confession of sins. My findings clearly demonstrate what a German Old Testament scholar, Klaus Westermann, wrote in his commentary to the Book of Lamentations, quote, "Lament has been severed from prayer in Christian piety throughout the history of the church. In the Old Testament, lamentation is an intrinsic component of prayer. In the Christian church, on the other hand, the lament no longer receives a hearing," end of quote. In Jewish tradition, the lament has been kept alive to somewhat greater extent than in Christianity. One example is Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, an annual day of mourning to commemorate the many tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people. First and foremost, the day commemorates the destruction of the first and second temples, but today it can include a commemoration of many other tragedies that has befallen the Jewish people. During the service of Tisha B'Av, the whole book of Lamentation is read. Back to Klaus Westermann. He writes, "For many, the very word lament carries a negative connotation. It is not quite proper to lament. For many, it is better to learn to suffer without lamenting. This especially holds true in the area of one's relationship to God. In this domain, the lament supposedly has no place at all. Lamentation is widely thought to be without authentic theological significance." End of quote. This is not the case in the Hebrew Bible. Here, the lament plays an important theological role, as we will see tonight. Klaus Westermann is also not the only one who has addressed this and talked about the importance of lament theology, but he was one of the first to focus on the relevance of this theology today. The question of relevance is a more recent development in biblical research over the last few decades, and tragedies as 9/11, the Hurricane Katrina, and July 22nd in Norway and others have contributed to a renewed interest for lament theology, both in religious practice and in biblical research. These tragedies showed a very immediate need for these voices. What we are going to do now is to look at some of these texts from the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, some of these examples of the uncensored voice, and to inquire about their theological significance. On the PowerPoint that is going to accompany this lecture, I will show some paintings, etchings, drawings, and sculpture by a German artist, Käthe Kollowitsch, who lived from 1867 to 1945. In her work, I discovered some of the same uncensored voice that I find in the Hebrew Bible. In her own words, she says, "It is my duty to voice the suffering of men," and I think then she means both men and women and children, "the never-ending suffering heaped mountain high." Sunday was Mother's Day, a day to celebrate all mothers and their love for their children. A lovely day, a happy day, a day for family and flowers, a day for hugs and kisses. For many women, though, Mother's Day is an especially painful day, a day that so clearly shows them what they do not have, a reminder of a dream unfulfilled. Infertility, the pain of wanting to conceive so badly and not being able to, the longing for a child. This is a pain that way too many experience. It is a loss of a dream, a loss of a future imagined. But it is often a lonely loss, a loss not easily shared. Mother's Day. Barrenness and struggle for children are well-known themes also in the Bible. Hanne, from the books of Samuel, is primarily known for her desire to have a child. The story tells that she was teased by her co-wife because she was barren, and it tells how she cried and would not eat. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly, 1 Samuel 1. In Genesis, in the ancestral stories, all the matriarchs, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, are portrayed as experiences periods of barrenness, and they all yearn to become pregnant. Even Abraham, the one who becomes the father for the Christians, the Jews, and the Muslims, he mourns being childless. But Abraham said, "O Lord God, what will you give me? I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus." Rachel threatens with death if she does not get children. "Give me children or I will die," she demands of Jacob. She is one of 17 characters who utters a wish to die in the Hebrew Bible. There is no doubt what Rachel wants. She wants children, or more specifically, in the context of the patriarchal values of the time, she wants sons. If she does not get sons, she claims, she will die. What this means have been debated. An Israeli Bible scholar called Yair Sakovich argues that her life is not worth living without children. Our friend Klaus Westermann says that death here means social death. If Rachel does not have children, she does not fulfill her role and has no future. Both readings might be right, but in addition, I believe that Rachel's demand here, the statement that she would die if she doesn't have sons, functions as part of a careful negotiation strategy to get what she wants. It is the first of several steps that she takes to try to achieve her goal. She envies again her co-wife, Leah, her sister, who has several children already. She desperately wants a child on her own. She negotiates with Jacob, her husband, and threatens with death. It doesn't work, though, and then she gives her maid Gilead to Jacob to have a child through her. She also negotiates with her sister Leah to get the mandrakes, a special herb, to help with conceiving. And in the end, God grants her a son. Nothing would have happened if Rachel had not spoken up in the first place, protesting her barrenness. The tragic outcome of Rachel's story, though, is that she dies, not because she has no children, but she dies in labor when she gives birth to her second son. Death in childbirth was not uncommon in ancient Israel, and it's still very common in many places in the world today. And death of small children was also part of everyday life. Scholars have estimated that in ancient Israel, women had to go through at least 6 pregnancies to see 3 children reach the age of 5. When Joseph's brothers sell him to the Egyptian as a slave, they bring his robe covered with animal blood to their father Jacob and say, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him." Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garment and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus the father bewailed him. The narrative points a powerful picture of a father mourning his son. Tearing the garments and putting on sackcloth were both typical acts of mourning in ancient Israel. Jacob's sorrow is strong that even he wants to join his son in death. "No, I shall go down to Sheol," which is the kingdom of death, "to be with my son." King David is another father who mourns and fights for the life of his son. The story in 2 Samuel 12 tells it like this. "The Lord struck the child that Uriah's wife bore to David, and it became very ill. David therefore pleaded with God for the child. David fasted and went in and lay all night on the ground. The elders of his house stood beside him, urging him to rise from the ground, but he would not, nor did he eat food with him. On the 7th day, the child died. And the servants of David were afraid to tell him that the child was dead, for they said, 'While the child was still alive, we spoke to him, and he did not listen to us. How can we then tell him that his child is dead? He may do himself some harm.' But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, he perceived that the child was dead, and David said to his servants, 'Is the child dead?' They said, 'He is dead.' Then David rose from the ground, washed, anointed himself, and changed his clothes. He went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. He then went to his own house, and when he asked, they set food before him, and he ate. Then his servant said to him, 'What is this thing that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while it was alive, but when the child died, you rose and ate food.' He said, 'While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows, the Lord may be gracious to me, and the child might live. But now he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me.' One cannot bring back a dead child. I was sitting on a rock. It was sunny in winter. I just prayed to die, but it didn't work. So Robert Richmond, a survivor for Bergen-Belsen, recalls. Praying for death did not work, is what he said. Not to this day, he added. This is the voice of the uttermost pain, the voice of someone who wishes to die. As Elaine mentioned, I am working on a current book project where I study all the narratives in the Hebrew Bible where a character, in one way or another, asks to die. They wish to die. There are 17 characters in the Hebrew Bible who either say they want to die, ask God to kill them, pray for death, or commit suicide. So far, my study shows that the death wishes are not all wishes to escape suffering, escaping life, but many of them are serving other rhetorical functions. As the one that we saw with Rachel, she says, I want to die, but what she really wants is to have a son, and she uses this death wish as a negotiation strategy. There are stories, though, in the Hebrew Bible of characters who, as Robert Richmond, truly wants to die. This I found somewhat remarkable of the biblical text, that the biblical text chooses to give voice even to that darkest moment in a person's life, the loneliest moment one can reach when someone prays to die. It is enough now, take away my life, Elijah asks God when pushed to his limits. Job questions God over and over again and says, why was I not buried like a stillborn child? He wants to have been a miscarriage. Why did you let me out of the womb? Better had I expired before an eye even saw me, he laments. This wish to have been dead before you were born, we also find among the texts from the prophet Jeremiah. And this wish goes beyond wishing simply to die. Wishing to die is a wish to end one's life here and now. Wishing never to have been born, being dead before you were born, is a wish to eradicate one's whole existence. You are wishing your life away. These wishes are never condemned by the Hebrew Bible authors. They are left there as part of the character stories and become part of the tradition. Suicide or voluntary death can be understood as a death wish put into action. And we also find some stories of suicide in the Hebrew Bible. Characters who decide to take their lives and the death in their own hands and end their lives. I'm not going to spend time on them tonight because they could fill a whole lecture by itself. But I have listed the occurrences here, and if any of you want a PowerPoint later, I am happy to send it to you. So here there are 6 suicide stories in the Hebrew Bible and 1 in the New Testament. And they are also left there without condemnation, but they are left there as part of these stories. Some of the most challenging texts that I teach from the Hebrew Bible, I teach in a course called Women, Gender, and the Hebrew Bible. And one of the topics that we work on when we work in that lecture is texts about sexual violence. Both in the metaphorical texts, poetic texts that portray the city of Jerusalem as a battered woman, a raped woman, an abandoned wife, and we also have rape narratives that we work on. These are very challenging texts to work with, and it's a lot of work to try to talk with them in a class. I wanted to mention one of these texts. It's an incest rape story. The story of Tamar, the daughter of King David, who is being raped by her half-brother Amnon. And we find the story in 2 Samuel 13. The extraordinary with this narrative is that it actually gives voice to Tamar. The rape victim gets her own voice and a place in the narrative. She speaks up against her rapist both before and after the rape. Amnon took hold of her and said to her, "Come lie with me, my sister." She answered him, "No, my brother, do not force me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do anything so vile. As for me, where should I carry my shame? And as for you, you would become as one of the scoundrels in Israel." Her voice is not respected, and she is violated by her brother, but she keeps her voice. She said to him, "No, my brother, for this wrong in sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said, "Put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her." So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. But Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she was wearing, and she put her hand on her head and went out, crying aloud as she went. Tamar is doing the same mourning rituals that Jacob did, putting ashes on her head, tearing her robe, putting her hand on her head, and crying aloud, all signifiers of mourning. The little book of Lamentation that is read on Tish B'Av is a response to the historical disaster, the grief of the destruction of Jerusalem, the city taken by military occupation and the portion of the leading citizens to Babylon. The book gives a disturbing and a powerful description of Jerusalem after the fall of the city. The focus in the book of Lamentation is not on the individual suffering, but on the collective suffering, the suffering of the people. And Lamentation 2 describes it as such. The elders of daughter Zion sit on the grounds in silence. They have thrown dust on their heads and put on sackcloth. The young children of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. My eyes are spent with weeping, my stomach churns, my bile is poured out on the ground because of the destruction of my people, because infants and babies faint in the streets of the cities. They cry to their mothers, "Where is bread and wine?" as they faint like the wounded in the streets of the city, as their life is poured out on their mother's bosom. The text even mentions cannibalism. Should women eat their offspring, the children they have borne? Should priest and prophet be killed in the sanctuary of the Lord? The young and the older are dying on the ground in the streets. My young women and my young men have fallen by the swords. In the middle of all the horrible description of tragedy in the book of Lamentation, there is also a strong encouragement to lament to God, to cry out to God. Cry aloud to the Lord, or wail of daughter Zion. Let tears stream down like a torrent day and night. Give yourself no rest, your eyes no recipe. Okay. Why do I bring about these sad, horrible stories? And why go all the way to the Hebrew Bible to find them? You may ask, isn't there enough sadness and horrible stories in the world today? Why couldn't we have told those stories? Of course there is. The sadness and the horror of the Hebrew Bible stories that we have just looked at is way too familiar. The reason why I believe it is significant to lift up that these stories also exist in the Hebrew Bible is that they are part of Scripture, of texts that for many people are seen as special texts, theological texts, even holy texts, both in Jewish and Christian tradition. And therefore, it is theologically significant to see that these texts do not shy away from telling these stories. They don't shy away from telling about pain and suffering, even the most gruesome life experience that we can imagine. They do not censor these parts of life. This telling of disasters that happened is important psychologically. Westermann writes, modern psychotherapy has long recognized that lamentation can have healing power, that openly expressing the pain of suffering can ameliorate its impact upon the suffering. And he continues, in the Bible then, the liberating possibility is open for the sufferers to bewail their suffering directly to God, end of quote. And this brings me to my next point. It is theologically significant to show how these life experiences were not hidden from God. Several of the characters that we have read about, they prayed to God, they lamented to God, they protested God. The text we just read from Lamentation encouraged lamenting to God in the midst of terror and horror. This does not mean that those who prayed and protested always got what they wanted. Many of these stories do not have a happy ending, but the stories show that it was perceived as legitimate to protest and lament in the presence of God. Scholars often call the laments that we have seen in the stories in the Hebrew Bible the informal lament. The lament is its primal setting in the place of human life in its original appearance, the informal lament. In addition, we find a more formal lament, its own lament genre. The lament is not less real, and it also has a point of departure in experience, but it is formulated in a structured genre that makes it easier to use and reuse for new experiences, and easier for us and other readers to make our own. We find this special genre of lament in the Lament Psalms, where the sufferers pour out their misery to God. O Lord, God of my salvation, when at night I cry out in your presence, let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry, for my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lie in the grave. So the psalmist cries out in Psalm 88, one of the many lament psalms in the Hebrew Bible. We find the lament psalms in the book of Psalms in the Hebrew Bible, and the book has 150 psalms or 151 in the Septuagint and the Catholic tradition in the Vulgata. 1/3 of these psalms are lament psalms. In other words, the lament voice gets a huge room, a significant room in the collection. Generally, the Psalms of Lament are characterized by 5 shared elements, and I put them here up on the PowerPoint for you. These elements show us the components of the theology of the Lament Psalms, and we are going to look at these specific characteristics for Psalm 88 and some other examples. First of all, the Lament Psalms all have an addressee. They are addressed to God. Both in the lament stories and in the lament psalms, the addressee is always God. Lament in the Hebrew Bible is not complaint into thin air. It is not self-catharsis. The lament has a direction. It is a prayer. The lament as a whole is a prayer, a cry to God. In Psalm 88, the opening line gives the direction of the psalm. O Lord, God of my salvation. Another example is in Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? The second element in a lament psalm is the lament itself. The focus of the lament can be lament or complaint over oneself, over one's own situation, and the Psalm 88 is an example of that. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to Sheol. I am counted among those who go down to the pit. I am like those who have no help, like those forsaken among the dead, like the slain that lies in the grave, like those forsaken among the dead, like the slain going down in the grave, like those whom you remember no more, for they are cut off from your hand. That the psalmist would complain over him or herself is maybe not so surprising to us. More surprising is it that the psalmist very often complains over God and God's actions. The complaint over God is the main complaint in Psalm 88. You, that is God, have put me in the depths of the pit, in the regions dark and deep. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you overwhelm me with all your waves. You, God, have caused my companions to shun me. You have made me a thing of horror to them. O Lord, why do you cast me off? Why do you hide your face from me? Wretched and close to death from my youth up, I suffer your terrors. I am desperate. Your wrath has swept over me, your dread assaults destroy me. They surround me like a flood all day long, from all sides they close in on me. You have caused friend and neighbor to shun me, My companions are in darkness. God is accused for the situation that the psalmist is in. Jeremiah, the prophet, he says it like this: O Lord, you have enticed me, and I was enticed. You have overpowered me, and you have prevailed. I have become a laughingstock all day. Everyone mocks me. For whenever I speak, I must cry out. I must shout violence and destruction. For the word of the Lord has become for me a reproach and decision all day long. God is the main problem for Jeremiah. The complaints that the psalmists are doing about God is primarily that God is distant and that God is inattentive. And the psalmists want to change this. Samuel Ballantyne writes, "Something terribly wrong has occurred in the life of the suppliant. What is wrong is not acceptable, and the lament is an act meant not only to call God's attention to the problem, but to secure its correction." The third kind of lament is the lament or the complaint over the enemy or over the other. This could be an actual enemy or a persecutor or a more general threat. The only reference to the others in Psalm 88 is in the statement, "You have caused friend and neighbor to shun me." But even if the psalm mentions the other, God is the one who is responsible. God is the one who is the problem. So we have to go to another psalm, Psalm 69, to see the complaint over the other. "You know the insults I receive, and my shame and dishonor. My foes are all known to you. Insults have broken my heart so that I am in despair. I looked for pity, but there were none, and for my comforters, but I found none. They gave me poison for food, and for my thirst they gave me vinegar to drink." Westermann writes, "Through the lament, the sufferer brings to expression a sort of pain which has affected the total person. In keeping with this fact, in the lament one finds reflected three dimensions of human existence as understood in the Old Testament. Suffering impacts upon the human being's relationship to oneself, to fellow human being, and to God." End of quote. In other words, as humans, we experience sufferings in three areas of life: in relationship to ourselves, in relationship with others, and in relationship with God. And because we suffer in three different areas and three different relationships, the lament psalms addresses laments or have included laments on all these areas. To return to the different characteristics of the lament psalm, there is a third element of present in the lament psalm, namely an expression of trust in God. That might seem contradictory to everything else I have said, but it is there, often towards the end of the psalm, an expression of trust in God. And scholars have been struggling to explain this presence of trust in the psalm. Some has argued that the psalm might have been recited in the temple, and when the lamenter or the psalmist have lamented their sorrow, then a priest responded to the psalmist with a word of salvation, and then the psalmist would again reply with a statement of trust. It's not a bad suggestion. The problem is that we don't have any evidence for it actually happening that way, and none of the psalms include the saying that would be from the priest. Maybe the statement of trust can be explained much more simply. Maybe some kind of trust in God has to be there for lament to happen in the first place. If there was no trust at all that God could do anything, or maybe not even a shiver of hope that God would actually hear one's lament, would one then lament at all? Maybe the trust in God that God actually would hear has to be there before one can lament. When the lament silence, it is because they don't trust, or we don't trust, that God actually will listen, or that we trust that we can say these things to God. In our example, in Psalm 88, we actually do not have a shift into trust. There is no trust statement in our psalm, and that makes it even more fascinating. The psalm ends in utter despair. "You have caused friend and neighbor to shun me. My companions are in darkness." If you're looking for trust in Psalm 88, the only statement would be when we say, God of my salvation, the introduction. That could be a statement of trust. The Psalms also includes prayer. The whole psalm is a prayer, but we also find direct prayers where they pray for specific things. Psalm 13:3 is one example. Consider and answer me, Lord, O God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep the sleep of death. And there is also a promise of thanksgiving and praise, often in the last part of the psalm. Psalm 13 continues and ends like this. But I trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he was dead. He has dealt bountifully with me. We have a 2-year-old. And just a few weeks ago, he shifted his favorite word from no and go away till why. The conversation that's going on sometimes now in the evening are something like this. We have to change into pajamas, Joseph. Why? Because you need to sleep. Why? Because Mama and Abba need to sleep. Why? Because we need to go to work in the morning. Why? Which actually is a good question. Why would we have to go to work in the morning? The Psalms also asks why, a little bit more serious than a 2-year-old. Psalm 88, verse 14 asks, O Lord, why do you cast me off? Why do you hide your face from me? Why? Why is the fundamental question in the laments. We find it again and again in the Psalms, also in the most well-known lament psalm, Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which was what Jesus uttered on the cross according to the Gospels. Why have you forsaken me? Another example of this why we find in Psalm 44, rouse yourself, why do you sleep, O Lord? Awake, do not cast us off forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? Why do you sleep, God? Again, the accusation that God is distant and God is inattentive. We find the why questions also in the other lament texts in the Hebrew Bible, the narratives that we've looked at. Rebecca asks why. Moses asks why on several occasions. Joshua asks why. Job asks why. And Jeremiah laments to God and asks, why is my pain unceasing, my wound incurable, refusing to be healed? Truly you, that is God, are to me like a deceitful brook, like waters that fail. Why? The Hebrew word that is translated pain here can mean both physical and emotional pain. Why is my physical and emotional pain unceasing? And again, God is the problem. You, God, is a deceitful brook. Klaus Westermann argues that lament arises when suffering is no longer explainable, when the suffering does not have an explanation. Contemporary trauma theory argues that one of the basic responses that we have to trauma is the need to construct meaning. Struggling with suffering is a struggle to make meaning out of what happens. And when there is no meaning, that is when the lament starts. The suggestion and question from Westermann actually triggers the question, is there indeed suffering that can be explained? If we go to the Hebrew Bible, there are times given explanation for suffering. Suffering is sometimes seen as God's deliberate action. The Deuteronomistic way of seeing history explains why Jerusalem fell and why the people had to go into exile by saying, indeed, Jerusalem and Judah so angered the Lord that he expelled them from his presence. The Hebrew Bible do sometimes give explanation for the suffering. I'm going to leave this and other explanation to side today because my main point is to say what happens when there is no explanation good enough. Then it's what the lament arises. Walter Brueggemann called these general explanations of suffering the common theology. And he says that what happens is that the lament is a protest voice that questions that common theology. He calls the protesting voice an embrace of pain. There is another question that is always raised in the, not always, but often raised in the Psalms, and that is, how long? How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I bear pain in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all day long? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? How long, O Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from their ravages, my life from the lions. The whole long question is basically a statement saying that this has gone on way too long already. When will it end? This is too hard. The Psalms of Lament is one example of the Hebrew Bible's theological response to suffering. Walter Brueggemann writes, "The lament is a Jewish refusal of silence before God." And he continues, "It is a Jewish understanding that an adequate relationship with God permits and requires a human voice that will speak up against every wrong perpetrated either on earth or by heaven. Where there is lament, the believer is able to take initiative with God and so develop over and against God the ego strength that is necessary for responsible faith. An adequate relationship with God permits and requires a human voice. Responsible faith, ego strength. We are very far away from Jesus wants me to be a sunbeam. This is the theology that I wish that the children's songs I learned as a child would have given me. I will end with where I started, with some reflection on my own journey. And this time, my experience with introducing lament in the classroom and in the chapel. Are we not complaining enough as it is? That was the response of one of my students when I lectured for the first time about lament theology. He shared a general negative association with laments and complained that Westermann has seen in many interpreters and in the Christian tradition. Are we not complaining enough as it is? Lament is seen as negative and not proper, especially not in the context of God. Another student in the class had a very different response. Why has no one told me this before? This response came from one of the older students in my class, and he came to see me in my office hours, and he shared with me how impressive or how these texts had made a huge impression on him, and he asked again, why has no one told me this before? In other words, this was something that he had needed. This was something that he had lacked. The words and the knowledge of the opportunity to lament. His teenager daughter had died just a few years before of cancer, and both him and, of course, the teenager daughter herself had been struggling and fought through her illness. She had written a notebook that he shared with me, a notebook that she had called The Wailing Wall. Why had no one told me this before? There is a need for words that give words to pain, protest suffering, and lament losses. I worked closely with one of the chaplains at my former school in Oslo, and together with some students, we made a liturgy to use once a week during Lent. It was a liturgy of lament, and all the text readings that we included were from the Hebrew Bible. We read the encouragement to lament from Lamentations 2. We read from the Lament Psalms and from Job, and we also read this powerful little stanza from 2 Chronicles 20, verse 12, which I had never, ever noticed before. I started working on this. It says, "We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you." Again, we had two kinds of responses. We asked some of the students to lead the services, and some of them said bluntly, no, I cannot say these words in the chapel. They were all biblical quotes, but they could not say them in the chapels. They could not make themselves say these words out loud. The other response was even more powerful. Some of the students never went to chapel. There were chapel every morning at 10 o'clock, and everyone was free to go as they wanted. And some of the students never went to chapel the whole year. They did not feel that there were any place for them there, that the words that were said were not meaningful for their lives. These students came to chapel every Wednesday during Lent to the Lament service. Finally, they were given words that described their lives, gave words to their pain, protested their suffering, and lamented their losses. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very rich presentation. We have a few minutes for questions, and we have microphones at the back. I have a question. So you talked about, you presented this as a theology of lament. And I was curious to hear a little bit about how, if in these narratives you see moments of divine response and how that fits into the theological vision of lament.
Okay, that's a challenge. Yes, I just touched upon it very briefly and said many of these stories doesn't have a happy ending. So in many of these situations there is no, I'm not going to say there's no response, but it's not necessarily a response that you would want. One of the things that I would say in all the stories about the death wishes, all the people who say they want to die and they ask God to kill them or to end their life, they are never heard. So Robert Richmond's statement that it doesn't work to pray for death is actually also true for the Hebrew Bible. They never do die. I think one of them, in the lament psalms, there clearly is a shift from the lament to the trust and the thankfulness. So there seems that the people actually often would have experienced some kind of divine response. We don't know what the response would have been, but they at some level feel that they have been heard and that they do get a renewed trust in God. In the stories, it's very hard to see. So Rachel, yes, she got a son. She got 2 sons, and then she died in childbirth. Job, he gets restitution, he gets his family back, but it's not the same family, and his children were still dead. So it's really hard. So I am not usually this depressing, I think, in my teaching and in my lecture. but I actually think that some of the main point was to say that there are these depressed voices, and it's important for me to say that they are there and we can need them and use them even if we don't get a happy ending answer. Because many of our lives don't get happy ending answers. So we have to live with that suffering and pain, and this gives a space to live with it, even if it's not taken away, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Dr. Levinson, are you familiar with the book, I think the name was Bright-Sided?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
The name of the book is Bright-Sided, and it's written by Barbara Eichenreich, the historian, and it's a contemporary book, or 10 years old max. And what she says sort of dovetails what you're saying, and that is we Americans, and particularly American women, have been taught to be happy, the happy face. That's actually on her cover. And she talks about the need to be real. And so I'm just mentioning that as a very modern, a very updated historical reference to exactly what you've been talking about.
Thank you. There was an anecdote that I was wondering, I'm sorry, there was someone, you wanted to, I can tell it later. You had a question, yes?
I want to speak for Pollyanna.
You're going to speak for Pollyanna, okay?
Yes. Actually, my family gave me, a video one year for Christmas because they thought I should be able to see it more. But I wonder about the middle of the lament. The glad game is not an easy game. It's very hard to come up with something, and it's also a kind of trust in the movie. You know, I think maybe Pollyanna's been trivialized a little bit.
Thank you. I will take it into consideration. Yeah. I never saw the movie. I read the book when I was a kid. I said, why would you be happy for crutches when you wanted it all? But now I can see your point. I just wanted to say, it's kind of an anecdote when you say that in the United States that people are expected to be happy, especially women. It has taken me time to get used to this question, how are you doing? Everyone asks that, right? And I didn't come to the United States before in 2001 as a PhD student, but I had met this American family in Israel when I was a student there. And it was like an American missionary family in Africa, and they came to Jerusalem for the summer, and they shared, we were in the same dorming house. And they asked me that one day, how are you doing? And I blurted out my frustration and my sorrow and my sadness, and this poor American family were totally freaked out. I really didn't know the conventions. I thought they asked me how I was doing, and I told them. So I'm not saying we should do that all the time. It's okay to say, how are you doing? I'm fine, thank you, and then walk away. But I think there is something, especially in the relationship with God, if we do believe in God, that we are allowed to say how we are doing and not do that happy face.
I'm a spiritual director, and people will come and say, I think I'm mad at God. Like, oh no, what am I going to do? And I say, that's okay. You can be mad at God. It's just fine. That God's big enough. And then I say, go to the Psalms and find those Psalms and read them and read them and read them. Because it does give permission to people to be mad at God. And, it's okay to be mad at each other, too. And that it isn't that they walk away from God. The faithfulness is there. But we get to say it aloud. And it's okay.
Thank you.
This is just a comment when you, those questions from the Hebrew Psalms, why and how long, it came right back to me, the Reverend Martin Luther King in one of his speeches. It's a rhetorical call and response. How long, Lord? Not long. How long? Not long.
Yep.
And he, of course, would have been very schooled in Scripture.
Thank you.
You said at the beginning of the PowerPoint that only 2 out of the 233 sermons had been over lamenting. Why do you think that is?
So I'm going to find this again. So I did this study of the Church of Norway, since that was the context I was in, and I did a study both of the readings in the church and the liturgies, both the Sunday service liturgies, funeral liturgies, and there is a third liturgy that was used for like catastrophe and tragedies, where there's like a big bus accident and 50 kids dies, then they have a special service for kind of tragedy situations. The readings were very powerful and striking to me because there are more lament texts read, but not the lament part. So you would read the trust part of the lament or the prayer, but not the lament part. So that even more, they knew of the Psalms, but they didn't include the lament text. I think there is this tradition in Christianity, primarily, where the lament had disappeared, that it somehow was set aside, and the complaint over your own sin was the main lament that you kept. One of the reasons, now I'm treading on difficult ground here because one of my colleagues, the Professor New Testament, is here, but I'm going to say that the New Testament does not have a lot of lament texts. Can we say that? Oh, he's shaking really now. Okay, I am saying that the New Testament does not have a lot. Yeah, it might. So Jesus quotes Psalm 22 on the cross, right? My God, why have you forsaken me? But there are not many texts that somehow give room for the lament in the New Testament. And I think that's one of the reasons, and I think but also in Jewish tradition, something happens, so the penitence or the confession of sin gets a bigger and bigger place, and not so much the lament over life. So there is a change in the spirituality, and that is more focused on sin than on suffering. And suffering is not seen as so problematic somehow. The sin is more problematic. So when the Church of Norway made these liturgies and these readings, that was in the 70s, I think, and then they would just follow up that kind of tradition, that you don't give room aloft to the lament voice. So it's part of, they have changed it a little bit. There was a liturgical, not reformation, but a liturgical revision in 2010, where they did both changes in the liturgy and in the readings. And one of the things that they did was that they added a fourth text in the liturgy. We read one text from the Old Testament, one from the Gospels, and one from the Acts, or from one of the letters, and they added a fourth reading. And the fourth reading is primarily from the book of Psalms. And then they also included more lamentation texts. So there is now a tendency to have at least a resource of using more of them. And that might have to do with more awareness of the need. In the funeral liturgy, you did find some of it. Because the funeral situation, when someone dies, there is a clear need to do this, right? And in the liturgies for the special tragedies that happens, all the texts were from the Hebrew Bible. And all of them were these kinds of lament texts. And again, the situation demands it. So somehow it hasn't been seen as a demand in the regular service, and then it comes up as a need in funeral situation and in these special services for tragedies and special happenings. But I hope that it will change more and more. I didn't include this here, but I kind of find it a bit curious. The two lament texts that I do read is Jesus' cry on the cross from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? So you read it on Good Friday. So it's then Jesus and not the people. And the other one is the text where Jeremiah complains about how horrible it is to be a prophet. And that is done on the day of the apostles, where the priest can say, oh, it's really hard to be a priest. So some of those are the two texts that I actually read. So it's even worse than what I said here. But the Church of Norway is a good church. My sister is a pastor there, so I shouldn't say anything badly about them.
Schooled in Catholic education, which I value very much, I think there was very definitely a strong message in the Catholic tradition that we offer up the pain. We offer it up for a greater cause, but in that process, I think maybe unintentionally there was a suggestion that somehow we need to tamp down the pain and give it over and not really deal with it, to deny it, to suppress it, that somehow it's not helpful and it will not lead to sanctity or holiness to dwell in the pain, but to offer it up for that greater good. So I think it's very strongly there. And then in the Jewish side of my family was very much given to lamenting and it was great because it felt, very real, and there was a permission. And I think about Mother Teresa, who, when she became real for me, was when she went through that period of questioning whether there was a God, whether God heard her. That was extremely freeing for me, and I think for others too.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, this is not a question having to do with this. I'm looking for a ride home to the Como area. I would have to be taking 4 buses home from here. Okay, thanks.
Oh, excellent. Okay, I think someone can give you a ride. Thank you. That was a lament, the cry for help. At this time, I would like to, as an expression of thanks from the theology department and on behalf of St. Catherine University, to present you, Hanne, with this. which is what do we call this? It's a lovely plaque. Thank you. I just needed the word. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you again for inviting me. It was an honor to be here.
Wonderful.
And I'm happy to talk with you afterwards, and also there is an email address if you want to have the PowerPoint to have the resources. Oh, what is wrong? Thank you. This is the chair of my department. She's here and she's taking care of me. It's wrong? Okay, it's wrong. Talk to me and I will give you my right email address. Okay, I won't even look at it then. It's all wrong.
So please join us for a few minutes of extra conversation and refreshment here in the back of the room. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.